Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm creating 2 interactive mermaid cards using several different products from Brutus Monro. I have the Underwater Friendship Stamp Set. I am using the Mermazing Stamp Set. I'll be using the sentiments as well as the mermaid and the little hat. And then we have these gorgeous 6-inch papers. This is the Coral Reefs paper pack. There are prints on both sides and they are absolutely stunning. I'm going to be using 2 of them for creating the backgrounds for my cards. And let me tell you, it was really hard to narrow down which 2 to use because, like I said, the prints are absolutely gorgeous and they're a nice weight of paper. I always love when printed papers have a really good weight to them. I know I'm going to be creating something in the future with these as well, just with those gorgeous backgrounds. I'm going to be creating 2 interactive cards using the One Light from Pear Blossom Press, as well as the Snap and Spin from Pear Blossom Press. So one of my cards is going to be a light up card. One of them is going to be a pendulum card so that our mermaid kind of rocks back and forth floating in the ocean. So before I do anything, I'm going to stamp my images. Now these stamp sets haven't been used yet, so I use a white eraser on the stamping surface just to remove any possible manufacturing residue. And then I use a soft brush to brush off any eraser bits. I'm going to do that to both of these sets. I'm going to be coloring them with Copic, so I'm going to be stamping them on some hammermill cardstock with some black Memento ink, and then I'll be doing my coloring all at once, and then we'll fussy cut them. They don't have matching dies to go with them, so they're going to be fussy cut, but the images themselves are fairly simple to cut out. So I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool so that I can stamp it a couple times and make sure that we have a nice crisp stamping of all of the images that I'm going to be using. The sentiments that I'm going to use later on, I'll be heat embossing them on those printed paper backgrounds, so we're not stamping those ahead of time. So I want to stamp them with the Memento ink because it's an ink that I like to use when I'm coloring with Copic markers. It is just a dye-based ink, so it washes off the stamps really, really easily. Now I'm going to leave the mermaid with the crown on there because I'm going to be using the mirror sheets from Pear Blossom Press, and I'm going to stamp the crown itself on that mirror sheet so that I can fussy cut it and put it on my mermaid. These mirror sheets actually are transparent, so you can put a light behind them and the light will shine through. So I thought it'd be fun to have like a light up glowing crown on my mermaid. So for that one, I did use some black StazOn ink. You need to use a permanent ink to stamp on those mirror sheets so that it doesn't rub off. And I'm going to set that aside to dry, let that dry while I'm coloring my images. It will take a little bit longer for that to dry than for the Memento ink on the hammermill cardstock. So I'm going to start off with 2 different pinks. I have RV02 and RV06. For all of the colors that I'm using, I'm just using 2 shades to keep the coloring fairly simple. You could use 3 shades if you wanted to get a little bit more deeper with your shading, but because the images themselves are fairly simple line work, I thought just 2 colors was good. So I start with the lighter color, the RV02, color the entire area, and then I go in with the RV06 and just add some of my shading, a little bit of the details, and again, I'm keeping it really, really simple. I've seen some beautiful coloring by people doing hair, and that is not me. I keep it really, really simple when it comes to coloring hair. I don't have the eye for the highlighting and the shading when it comes to doing individual strands and all of that. So we're going to keep it really, really simple. And I just wanted to keep the color fun. So I chose pink for the hair for this one. I'm going to be doing blue for the little shells as well as her tail. And then I'm going to swap it for the second image. So one is going to have pink hair, one's going to have blue hair, one's going to have like a blue scales and stuff like that. The other one's going to have pink. Now, this would be a fun place to do interference inks on them as well, just to add a little bit of shimmer. But because our backgrounds have so much detail to them, I kept it fairly simple. So you can color with Copic markers as much or as little as you want. You can keep going over the same area, which is one of the things that I love about them. They're not going to start to pill the paper. When you use dye-based markers, the paper starts to pill fairly quickly and starts to rub up, if you will. That doesn't happen with Copic markers. And the other thing that I love about the Copic markers is you can add mediums over top of them. So I'll regularly add glossy accents for areas that I want some glossy dome dimension, or I will add some stickles, and I'm going to do the stickles on the tails of the mermaid. So not only do they have the bright bold color, but they're also going to have some glitter to them. So I'm going to do that same pink combination on the hats. So again, starting with the RVO2, do the lighter color, then the darker color, and then back over the lighter color to blend them together. For my blues, I'm doing BG01 and BG05. For that first mermaid, it's going to be for her little seashells as well as the tail. And I'm going to do the same method for all of them. Do the light color first, go in, add my shading, and then go back in and blend it together with the light color. Now, this is the way that I learned coloring with Copic markers. I know there are people out there that do the dark color first and then they blend it with the light color. I would suggest trying both ways and see which way works best for you. I keep meaning to try the other way, but this is what I've always done. This is what I'm comfortable with. So I tend to just do this without really thinking. For my skin, I'm using some EO2 and EOO. So I start with the OO, then go in with the O2, and then go back in with the OO to blend it all together. Like I said, keeping it very, very simple. Now, I do make a mistake and I end up doing the face of the second one in that O2, but it's really not that much darker than the OO, so you can easily get away with it. And obviously, there's many different colors of skin tone, so you can obviously change it up to do the color skin tone that you prefer. Now, these cards are part of a collaboration hop, both on Instagram as well as YouTube, with Brutus Monro and Pear Blossom Press. So they're all going to be in the same playlist on those channels. So I would suggest definitely checking out all of the different inspiration. I believe we all got the same products, so there's a lot of different inspiration to be had. And there's always fun finding different ways to add interactive elements to cards. It's really quite easy to do. It's something that sounds like a complicated thing, but it's really not that complicated, and it adds such a wow factor to your creations. So for the second girl, I used the BG01 and the BG05 for her hair, again, doing the light color first. Then I added the shading for the darker color, then went back over it with the light color. For the first one, for the fish, I'm going to do YRO2 and YRO4. Again, doing the light color first, adding a little bit of shading with the YRO4, and then going back in with the YRO2. Now, these fish would be a great place to add the glossy accents, to add some glossy dome dimension to them. I don't do it. I only do stickles on the mermaid tails just to add that sparkle. But I think these guys would be really fun to have that glossy dome dimension on them. For the second fish, I'm doing YO2 and YO8. I wanted them to be nice and bright, coordinate with some of the fish in the background, as well as be a different color than our mermaids. So again, doing the light color first, going in, adding the shading with the darker color, and then going back in with that lighter color. And I also do that same yellow on the flower on the hat. Now you can see that I don't color the crown on that first mermaid there because it's going to be that silver with that mylar. So I'm going to end up cutting most of that crown off. I'm going to leave that little bottom ridge so that I have something to cut or to glue the mylar piece onto. I wanted to have an area for that, but I want to have my crown to be that silver color. So I'm using some detail scissors in order to cut these images out, and I'm cutting them right on the outside of that stamped line. The shapes are fairly simple, and it really only takes a few minutes to cut them out, and then we can add them to our printed paper backgrounds and have them look like they're swimming in those beautiful ocean scenes. Now, I'm right-handed, so when I do fussy cutting, I have my scissors in my right hand. I use my left hand to move the piece that I am fussy cutting. The right hand, or my scissors in my right hand, pretty much stay stationary or fairly stationary. That's the best way to get the best results. So I did the one on screen and the rest of them I did off screen. Then I'm using a shimmer gel pen just to add a little bit of shimmer to the hair. I'm going to add the stickles to the mermaid tails, but I wanted to have a little bit of shimmery streaks through the hair. So I'm using that gel pen for it. It's very, very subtle. It doesn't really even show up on camera, but it's just a great way to add some subtle detail to it. Another option would be to say use a white gel pen and add some white highlights and white accents too. I have my crown there that I die cut or fussy cut off screen. I'm going to put some glue on the bottom part of the crown that I left on the mermaid's head. Add that to, or put the crown on top of that and then let that dry. And because it's a mylar sheet, it's not porous like cardstock is, so it is going to take just a little bit of time for that to dry. And while we're waiting for that to dry, I put some stickles on the flower on the hat as well as the mermaid tail. I'm going to leave it for probably about an hour. I think I left it for about an hour for it to completely dry. The drying time really just depends on how thick of a coat you do. I just wanted to make sure that it was good and dry before I continued on and completed my cards. Now, this is a step that can be done after your cards are assembled. On this particular day, I had something else to go do, so it might as well take up my drying time while I'm busy doing something else. I chose to use some gems on the crown. So I have some prism gems here. These have some really pretty purpley blue iridescence to them. So they're perfect to go on that crown and to go with the colors for this card. I use a die pick to pierce into the adhesive behind the gem and then just place them where they go. And there's 4 different colors or 4 different sizes. So I chose a larger one for the middle and then smaller ones for the 2 side ones. So after my pieces have dried, this is what they look like. Absolutely adorable. And we're ready to create our interactive elements for our card. So I'm going to start with the pendulum card first. And I've done this several times. It's a really easy mechanism to create. All you need is a snap and slide or snap and spin from Pear Blossom Press, a piece of acetate that is trimmed to a 1/2 inch wide, and then a washer for a weight, as well as some foam tape. Before I create the mechanism, I'm going to stamp and emboss my sentiment on that background there. I chose to stamp and emboss it with silver embossing powder so that it doesn't take away from that background scene. If you wanted it to show up more, you could do some white embossing powder, but I wanted it to be something that when we tilted in the light, we could see it nice and clearly, but it didn't really detract from our background scene. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that background, stamped it with some Versamark ink, and then poured on that silver embossing powder. Then I tap off the excess and use my heat tool to melt that powder on there. If by chance you have some flakes of silver embossing powder where you don't want it to go, just use a soft brush to brush it off before you melt that powder on there. Now I chose to do the sentiment on the bottom of this card so that my mermaid would be a little bit higher and we'd have room for the pendulum to be hanging behind the scene behind her. So I have these like to move it die sets. I'm using these circle die to just create a hole for my snap and spin to go through. You could just use a small circle die. It doesn't have to necessarily be this set, but you do want one that's a little bit bigger than the post on the snap and spin, but you don't want it to be too big. So I taped it in place with a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape. Then I ran it through my die cutting machine, and now we can add that snap and spin. This is just the mechanism that is going to give it some movement on the card. They snap right together. I'm going to use some glue dots in order to add that piece of acetate to that snap and spin. I'm also going to use a glue dot to glue a washer to the bottom. Now the washer that I'm using is fairly tiny. It's nice and thin, but it's just going to add some weight so that that pendulum will swing back and forth behind my card, and it's going to create a rocking movement for my mermaid. After I put that washer on there, I do like to use my scissors to trim underneath it. I want to make sure there's not any pointed edges that might stick in my foam tape on the back of my card. And by trimming around that, I can make sure that that's not going to happen. I have some double thick foam tape here that's going to leave lots of room for my pendulum to swing back and forth. I'm fairly liberal with it on the back of my card. I want to make sure that that piece of cardstock there is nice and supported. Now, typically I'll put my mermaid on that snap and spin before I glue everything together. This particular time I didn't, but I did put a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape that in place to make sure that my pendulum was hanging straight down. I want to make sure that when I glue this onto my card base, it doesn't happen to move behind my foam tape. I don't want to tape it down. I want to make sure that that still has room to move freely. So I glue this onto my A2 card base. My printed paper there is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches so that we see a little bit of that white card base behind it. Once we have that glued to the background of our card, I put a glue dot on top of that, and we can glue our mermaid there. And you can see that she moves back and forth. It looks like she's kind of floating in the water. This is just, again, a great way to add some movement to a card. This would be fun for a boat. I've done it with a rocking chair, just anything that could possibly rock back and forth. It's a fun but really easy mechanism to create and just give your card movement. For the second card, I'm going to use a one light. Now I am using a one light that goes in the Halo one light combo pack because there's a little bit more space between the light and the button trigger. And I wanted to make sure that I could put my Press Here stamp on the side of my card and have enough room or space between it for my crown to go. Now, originally I thought I was going to put the Press Here on the left side of the card. I end up putting it on the right side of the card, but this was just a test to make sure that I had a good amount of space between where I wanted that sentiment to go and where I want my light to light up. So I'm using the Pear Blossom Press stamp and die set. This one has some great trigger words to it. It's got push pull. I use the one that says Press Here. It's nice and small. You could even use the circle die to create a button to have that Press Here on it. I'm going to heat emboss it to the background of the card so that it is in the silver, the same silver that I'm going to heat emboss my sentiment as well as the anchor from the stamp set. But I want it to coordinate with the rest of the card. I don't want it to be standing out and be different from the rest of those sentiments. So I stamped it. I used just an acrylic block for this rather than using my Misty stamping tool, just to make it nice and easy. That way I could just stamp that single sentiment on there. Then added that embossing powder and heat embossed that sentiment. Before we create the rest of the mechanism for this, I want to add my sentiment from that set. There's also an anchor in that set that I thought would work perfect because the sentiment says something about being my anchor. So it works perfectly with the anchor stamp in that set as well. So I'm stamping that anchor towards the bottom left, right within that coral there. This sentiment is going along the top. Once again, putting a little bit of embossing powder tool on the paper so that my embossing powder sticks just to where I have the image and the sentiment stamped in Versamark ink. Then we can add that embossing powder, tap the excess off, and we can heat emboss both of those pieces. Now I use super fine embossing powder when it comes to sentiments when possible, because it just gives you so much more detail. Now you can see when I'm heat embossing them that the sentiment itself, you can see it, but it's not so prominent from that background that it pops out. Typically, you'll have to kind of tilt it into the light to really see it. But again, it works perfectly with that background. Now I wanted that anchor to stick out just a little bit more. So I'm using a silver gel pen just to color in the insides of it, just to make it a little bit more prominent. Once we have that done, I'll let that dry for a few seconds, and then we're ready to create our light up feature with our mermaid. So for that light up feature, I want to make sure that that light shows through the cardstock. So I'm going to lay that light on top of, so the button is right on top of the Press Here that I embossed there. And I'm using a paper piercer or a die pick in order to pierce a hole in that cardstock so that there's an area for that light to shine through. Then I'm going to use some double-sided tape to stick that mechanism on the back of the card so that the light shows through the hole and the button trigger is right behind the Press Here. And then I test it just to make sure. I don't press down hard on that adhesive until I'm sure that I have the placement absolutely perfect. Now you could glue this mermaid down flat, but I want to make sure that that light shines kind of behind the crown and kind of creates a bit of a glow to it. So I add my foam tape behind my mermaid. I just use some smaller pieces, and this is just going to pop her up a little bit and give that light room to shine right behind her crown there. So once we have those pieces on there, we can take the backing off. Then we can add the mermaid to the front of the card. Now the foam tape I'm using is a double thick foam tape. If you don't happen to have this, and I do have it listed in my description with all the other supplies that I'm using, if you don't happen to have this or have other foam tape, you could always use a double layer. You just want to make sure that that foam tape, especially when it comes to the back of this card, that has some really good dimension to it. We want to make sure that we have enough dimension so that our battery pack for our one light doesn't create a bow or a bump in the front of our card. So you want to make sure that there's enough space for that. And then with our pendulum card, you want to make sure that there's enough space for that piece of acetate with that washer to swing back and forth and give some good movement. If it's not thick enough, it's going to restrict that movement and you're not going to have as much movement on the pendulum on the front. So once we have that tape on the back of our printed paper, I'm going to add it to our A2 card base. And once again, that printed paper is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. So we see a little bit of our white card base behind there. And then we have 2 interactive cards. Super easy to create. The hardest part really is picking out your colors and doing the coloring. The actual mechanisms for those interactive elements are super easy. So I did turn my lights off in my room so that you could see that glow just a little bit better on screen. Obviously, in real life, you're not going to have to turn the lights off. You're going to be able to see it, but on camera, it just shows up a little bit better when we turn the lights off, so you can see how much that one light actually does glow and give you some fun interactive light up feature. And it's always a great wow factor when you give someone a light up card because they don't really expect it. I love the way you see the light around the crown, so it makes it look like it glows just a little bit. Then we have our mermaid floating in the sea with that pendulum background there. And I chose the colors for these mermaids based on the coral, the colors of the paper, as well as the fish that are floating in there. So they work perfectly with those backgrounds of those gorgeous papers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.